So this tutorial is for a tubular cast on. This particular cast on is going to be for Dragonheart Legwarmers. As you can see, it provides a really stretchy cast on edge that's good for going over your legs and your feet and fits really snugly. For this cast on, we're going to be using yarn, size 5 double point needles, scissors, and I like to use a clip-on stitch marker or a small safety pin would also work. To begin, for this cast on, I'm going to use 1 double point needle, and just like for a long tail cast on, I need enough yarn to cast on my stitches. For the leg warmers, it's going to be 48 stitches. I'm not going to use a slip knot. For this tutorial, we're going to just do a simple twist. So I'm going to come underneath the yarn with my needle. I'm going to pull up and twist around. This is going to mimic a knit stitch, whereas a slip knot would mimic a purl stitch. Holding the yarn, I'm going to have a long tail on the bottom, and I'm going to have my working yarn on top. So I've got my long tail on my thumb and my working yarn on my finger. We're going to be using a 2x2 rib for the leg warmers, but we're going to cast on in a 1x1 rib and later manipulate the stitches so that it becomes 2x2 rib. So since I'm doing 1x1 rib, this is my knit stitch. I'm going to start with a purl stitch. I'm going to go over the top strand, underneath both strands, into the middle, back to the top. That's my purl stitch. Now I'm going to do a knit stitch. I'm going to go under the bottom strand, into the middle first, over the top strand, and underneath both. So now I've done a knit, purl, knit, and you can see that's a purl stitch. There's a small bump right there. So I'm going to do another purl stitch. Over the top, underneath both, into the middle, back to the top. I can tell this is a purl stitch because my working yarn is in the front. So now I'm going to do a knit stitch, into the middle, over the top, underneath both. For this particular cast on, since we're doing 48, that's going to be 12 stitches divided onto 4 double point needles. So I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 stitches. So I'm going to do purl, knit, purl, knit, purl, knit. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. I'm going to do one more purl. So over the top, into the middle, back to center. Now you may be choosing to do magic loop on circular needles. If you're doing that, you just continue to cast on. If you're using double point needles like me, you can either continue to cast on until you fill up your needle and then transfer the stitches later. But I'm going to go ahead and introduce a new needle now. I'm going to hold my new needle on top of the old needle, and I'm going to insert it into the center, getting ready for a knit stitch because that was a purl stitch. Now at this point, because I have 2 needles in my right hand, instead of manipulating the needle, I'm going to manipulate the yarn to go over the top of the needle. I'll do that one more time. So I'm going into the middle first, just like a knit stitch, and then underneath both strands. So there's my knit stitch. At this point, if I'm pulling the yarn, oh hi kitten. If I'm pulling the yarn tight enough, I can drop that first stitch and continue on, or drop that first needle and continue on my second needle. So that was a knit stitch. So I'm going to purl over the top, into the middle, back to center, knit, into the middle, over the top, back to center, purl over the top, into the middle, back to center, knit, into the middle, over the top, back to center. So I'm going to go ahead and continue until I have all 48 stitches, and then I'll show you how to join in the round. So at this point I have just cast on my last stitch. It's a purl stitch, and as you can see my double point needles are just kind of hanging below here. So I want to make sure I don't lose this purl stitch because it's not very secure. So I'm going to twist, an extra twist, pull that tight, and then transfer both strands into my right hand. Then I'm going to check my long tail. Sometimes if you make the long tail too long, it gets in the way. I'll just snip a little bit off right there. So it's just a few inches long. Now I need to make sure, whether you're doing magic loop or double point needles, you need to make sure that you're not twisting your stitches. So if I bring the double point needles around, what I'm looking for is that all of the bumps of the bottom of the stitches are in the center and all of the loops are on the top. So starting with the first one, loops on the top, bumps in the center. Second one looks good. Third one looks good. Fourth double point needle looks good. So I'm ready to begin. I'm going to slide the stitches over. And I'm going to grab my 5th needle, which is going to be my working needle. So that I don't lose that last stitch, I'm going to go ahead and knit the first stitch with both my working yarn and my long tail. Now I can drop my long tail and feel confident that that last stitch is secure. When casting on for tubular cast on, you are going to do what's called double knitting, which means that it's going to take me 2 rows to work all of the stitches. In the first row, I'm simply only going to knit the knit stitches, and I'm going to slip all of the purl stitches. When you're slipping the purl stitches, you're going to slip them with the yarn in front, purlwise. We always slip purlwise. We're putting the yarn in front because that's where the yarn normally goes when you're working a purl stitch. So I'm going to bring the yarn to the back and knit the knit stitch. Yarn in front, slip the purl stitch purlwise, yarn in back, knit the knit stitch. So I'm only working the knit stitches on this row. Yarn in back, knit the knit stitches. I'll continue in this pattern until I get back to the beginning of the round. Slip that and knit the knit. When I get back to the beginning of the round, then I'm going to do the opposite and work the purl stitches. And yarn it back. I have finished knitting all my knit stitches and slipping all my purl stitches. I can tell I'm back at the beginning of the round because here's my long tail, and that's my dog snoring in the background. So now I'm going to do the opposite. I'm going to slip all of the knit stitches and purl all of the purl stitches. Now remember, with this first stitch, we knit with the long tail and the working yarn. So I'm going to slip both strands. I'm slipping it with the yarn in the back because that is where the yarn goes when you are working a knit stitch. And I'll bring it to the front and purl that purl stitch. Yarn in back, slip the knit stitch. You'll notice I'm slipping it purlwise, which means as if I were going to purl the stitch. If I slipped the stitch knitwise, it would twist the stitch, and I don't want to do that. So I'm going to go from back to front, slip it off as if to purl bring the yarn in front and purl the next stitch. When I'm done with this second round, I'll have worked each stitch only once. And then when I'm done with that, we will manipulate the stitches so that we are going to work in the 2x2 ribbing instead of the 1x1 ribbing. Once again, back at the beginning of my round, I've just finished knitting, slipping all the knit stitches and purling all the purl stitches. I can tell I'm back at the beginning of the round because here's my long tail from the first stitch that I cast on. So now that we've worked each stitch once, we're going to manipulate the stitches so that we're working in a 2x2 ribbing instead of a 1x2 ribbing. So we're going to start with our knit stitches. We want to knit the first stitch. Remember, we have 2 strands here from when we worked in the long tail with the working yarn, so I'm going to knit both of those. I'm going to pull my long tail so it's nice and snug. Now I have a purl stitch, but I don't want a purl stitch. I want 2 knit stitches together. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to slip purlwise the next 2 stitches. I'm going to take the knit stitch off of the right hand needle and hold it between my thumb and my forefinger. And I'm going to slip the purl stitch back on to the left hand needle. I'm going to pick up that knit stitch that I was holding and slip that back on as well. So when I began, I had a purl and a knit. Now I have a knit and a purl. So I knit the first stitch. I'm going to knit the second stitch. Purl and purl. So as you can see, now I'm working in a 2x2 ribbing. Knit, knit, purl, purl. The next stitch is knit, so that's the first of our 2 knits. And I'm back at another purl stitch where I want to knit. So I'm going to slip, slip, hold the knit stitch, place the purl back on the left needle, place the knit stitch on the back on the left needle. So here's my second knit, purl, and purl. Once I have finished working all of the stitches, I will have my 2x2 ribbing. The knit 1, knit 2, purl 1, purl 2. Now I'm back at the beginning of the round. I have manipulated all my stitches, so I'm working in a 2x2 ribbing now instead of a 1x1 ribbing, and I'm ready to begin just working as normal on the cuff of my Legwarmers. So now I'm going to use my clipping stitch marker, or if you have a safety pin that'll work, and I'm going to clip it to the stitch just below the first one in the round. We've been using the long tail as an indicator of where the round begins, but as we work, that long tail is going to get further and further away, and it's going to be more difficult to see. So if I clip this on, it's a more visible indication of the beginning of the round. And as you can see here, I have it right here, so I can see that when I get to this double point needle, it's the beginning of the round. It's kind of far away now, so I'll unclip it, move it back to the top, and once again it is more visible.